This essay is from Gao Artai's autobiographical essay collection In Search of My Homeland. Gao Artai, a Chinese painter, was punished in the 1950s for publishing the article on beauty and underwent re-education through labor at the Jiabianguo labor camp. Released from prison in 1962, he worked at the Dunhuang Research Academy with the help of Chang Shuhong, the academy's then director. Quiet at the Senqing Temple narrates the author's experiences during this period. The Dunhuang Research Academy manages the UNESCO-listed Morgul Caves, located 16 miles southeast of Dunhuang in China's Gansu province. Known as the Thousand Buddhas Caves, this 500-temple complex is situated at a Silk Road cultural and religious junction.
Quiet at the Senqing Temple. Written by Gao Artai. Translated by Robert Dorset and David Pollard. I arrived in Dunhuang on June 2, 1962, and stayed at the hostel for a few days before I moved to the lower temple. The Morgul Caves area originally had 3 temples. One was at the southernmost tip of the valley's long, narrow stretch. Formerly called Lane Temple, it was now simply known as the Upper Temple. At the time of my arrival, it had become the dormitory for family members of the Institute's staff, and in its sundry courtyards, household belongings were piled up, clothes were hung out to dry, and chickens and ducks scurried everywhere. Each family dumped puddles of filthy wash water in which the squalid ducks temporarily alleviated their homesickness. Close by was the Middle Temple. Originally a Lama temple called Huangqing, it had been refurbished to house the Institute's offices, workshops, meeting rooms, hostel, kitchen, dining halls, and so on. There was calligraphy above the front gate. Dunhuang Research Institute for Cultural Relics. The Lama who remained, a man, Xu Su, and a woman, Bao Nai, were moved into the upper temple. Xu Su was more than 70 years old when I arrived. A tall, gaunt man, like Don Quixote in the illustrations, he tended the Institute's sheep, often remaining in the mountains for days at a time. Bao Nai, over 80, still wore her dark purple vestments. Extremely skinny, hunchbacked, and only about 3 feet tall, she walked with a cane, leaning forward, tottering side to side, as if about to fall. She had a rasping voice but clear, sharp eyes. Often hordes of fierce-looking muscular men came across the desert to pay her homage. They called her Lao Da, the Eminent One, in reverence and awe. In front of the door to her dark low shanty, spirited proud stallions belonging to those men were tied. The stallions snorted loudly, dug the ground with their forehoofs, and rattled their bridles as they lifted and dropped their heads. The lower temple, a Taoist temple still with its original name plaque, Senqing Temple, was located outside Morgul Caves Mountain Gate at the northernmost edge of the narrow, long forest about half a mile from the upper and middle temples. It was said that in earlier times someone had been hanged inside, and that later a Tao priest had been beaten to death there by bandits. There were also legends of fox spirits and demons. It was a bit mysterious, a bit terrifying, and for a long time no one had lived there. Paint flaked from its porticos, spiderwebs hung from dust-covered beams, leaves heaped in the courtyard, and weeds overgrew paths. Not far from the back door was the famous Sanjing Cave, where the vigorous and sturdy calligraphy was to be found on an inner wall. The mountain gate, which was just beyond the front gate, displayed 3 characters, Mo Gaoku, that had been scraped and brushed over with lime. However, on close examination, the resolution of the brushstrokes, their weightings, their structure, their compelling, pure spirit, and within their unrestrained ease, the vigor that shone through, could still be seen. About a third of a mile past the mountain gate there was an archway with fresh, brightly painted plaques on the front and back, each with 4 characters brushed. The flashy, gilded characters and the blue background hurt the eyes, and I didn't like their attention-grabbing coquettishness. I enjoyed the quiet at Senqing Temple, so I asked to live there, and the office agreed. I cleaned out a side wing, moved in, and remained for 3 years. Later the Institute decided to move their offices into the lower temple and began to refurbish it, so I was forced to move to the upper temple to be in proximity to others, to enjoy the noise of socialization and the joyful clamor of chickens, ducks, and children. Refurbishing completely changed the appearance of Senqing Temple, but it never became offices, because immediately afterward, the Cultural Revolution broke out. I didn't like the Upper Temple, but I wasn't there long because once the Cultural Revolution arrived, they ransacked my living quarters and sealed them off, and I had to take my bedroll and move into the cowshed. The cowshed was never in one place. However, the only fixed place I was nostalgic for was the lower Sencheng Temple with its dark moss and chilly dew. The 49 people at the Institute were assigned to the research, cave preservation, or the administration departments. Research was subdivided into the fine arts section, archaeology section, and the reference room. I was with fine arts. There were 9 of us. Our main responsibility was to research the murals and paint copies. Work was assigned at the beginning of the year according to the annual plan and was distributed to each person. Everyone was responsible for his own work, and the 7 or 8 of us plus those in archaeology, which made 20 people, were scattered among nearly 500 caves. This gave us freedom. During the day I painted copies or leafed through books in the reference room, and after work I ate in the dining hall and went home. Although the work didn't bore me, I enjoyed returning home to Sencheng Temple. It was a world belonging only to me, and the farther away from crowds I was, the wider this world was. Outside my room's eastward-facing window, dozens of large trees sparsely occupied large tracts of land. It took 2 or more people to link their arms around the trunks, so they were called the devil claps his palms by the locals. Beyond these sporadic stands of trees was the river, with its continuously flowing water. Several shelly pagodas containing holy relics from ancient times were visible on the opposite bank, past the wild clumps of shrubbery higher on the slope. Sanway Mountain was beyond. When I returned at early dusk and opened my door, the light of the setting sun, reflecting from the craggy red cliffs of Sanway Mountain, was like a flame in which scintillating layers of gold, silver, purple, and red pranced. The rays dyed the river red and projected pale blue shadows from the trees onto the room's east wall. Now and then a bird flew, a fish jumped, and layer upon layer of bright ripples played along the wall. I often stood for a long time, motionless, by the window watching those flames gradually darken until the mountain was deep purple, and then I lit my old-style, glass-covered kerosene lamp and applied myself to the subjects I had been given. On the table were piles of old, yellow-paged, cord-bound volumes. I realized that to research Dunhuang art at Dunhuang was a rare opportunity, and that for my safety and benefit I needed to take advantage of it, to delve into these piles of old papers and become an expert. This was my primary motive for coming, and to be able to come was very fortunate. I was grateful to Mr. Chan Shuhong for helping me and anxious for him to know that I was the right person. Because of my own interest and desire for success, I threw myself into research and copying, and many times I'd spend days or even weeks trying to resolve a very minute problem, for example, the discrepancy between a line of Buddhist scripture and a variation, or the specific date of such and such an inscription in such and such a cave. I spent an entire year in cave number 465 painting copies of Yuan Dynasty Buddhist murals, which I didn't like. Late one night I was thirsty, and went back to cave 465 to retrieve my thermos bottle. The trees were huge, the forest dark, and in the moonlight, shadows spread over the ground. I could hear my footsteps distinctly. An intermittent tinkling came from the iron horses beneath the eaves of the Tang and Sun caves, and even within the thick forest these ancient sounds seemed close by. Larger sand particles falling from steep cliffs, hitting the wooden eaves and walkways, made the quiet seem quieter, quiet as the Gobi. I walked down the long sandy path, climbed the high ladder, entered, and left the dark cave, submerged myself again in the empty gloomy temple, and felt I had become a ghost along the way. I opened the door, saw the dim yellow lamplight falling on the tabletop's old decaying books, and suddenly had a horror of being buried. In the endless grave of silence, the ancient dead seemed alive, and although I was living, it seemed I had died. In the past I was tossed on waves of politics and thirsted for quiet, dreaming of a harbor to settle my body and mind, and now I had achieved quiet but at the same time realized it wasn't tranquility. This gentle, tender quiet had a cold, hard core. It was an intermediary between an instant and eternity, and a bridge to the void. I sensed this rather than thought it through, and began to want to escape. I sorted out the pieces of miscellaneous paper on which I had written in very small letters everything I had seen, had heard, had thought while I was at Jahatine Farm, and read them carefully. I felt I had returned to that former life of forced labor, starvation, and humiliation, and felt even that life was better than the present one, in which I had become a walking corpse from an ancient grave. I read, and without being aware, began to write again. I wrote about the value of man, his alienation and restitution. I wrote about the pursuit of beauty and human freedom, and that beauty is the symbol of freedom. I knew I was playing with fire but didn't care, because except for playing with fire, I couldn't find a connection to the outside world, to my time, to human history, and I needed that connection just as I had needed quiet and solitude. While I wrote, I felt the joy of being resurrected, but I lost the sense of safety, so I always latched my room from the inside. Sometimes the wind blew, the door rattled, and startled, I'd suddenly turn my head toward the door, my heart pounding. Those writings were lost during the Cultural Revolution. Most fell into the hands of the revolutionary masses and were used as evidence against me, but I have no regrets. While I wrote, I was alive.
Why do I recommend reading the article Quiet at the Sanqing Temple? I highly recommend the entire book In Search of My Homeland. The author's writing is exceptionally beautiful, and the characters are vividly portrayed. As an artist myself, I appreciate how his words evoke strong visual imagery. Two articles from this book deeply resonated with me, Emerging from Death and Quiet at the Sanqing Temple. They share a common theme of escaping death and reviving from a lifeless existence, highlighting the importance of creation in life. Quiet at the Sanqing Temple particularly strikes a chord with me because it mirrors my current situation. Why do I choose to share my thoughts through YouTube videos? Firstly, it's all about reaching a wider audience. YouTube provides a public platform that allows me to share my ideas not only with friends, but also with a broader community. Secondly, using videos adds a personal touch, akin to adapting a novel into a film. I incorporate my insights and thoughts from the original works into my creations. I use illustrations because they make the content more accessible and easier to understand. Currently, it's like a slideshow presentation, not perfect, but I'm continuously learning and improving. Could you explain how the article relates to your current situation? This is quite personal. I've always been a work enthusiast, almost to the point of being a workaholic. However, in the past year or two, I've found less satisfaction in my job. It started feeling monotonous, almost like going through the motions, similar to what's described in the article. Inspired by the book, when I started creating these videos, I felt rejuvenated and came back to life. It reaffirmed my desire for a creative job that truly energizes me.